Hello and welcome to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill. This is a podcast in which an esteemed guest joins me to talk about the big ideas, the bad ideas, the problems and the controversies of life in the early 21st century. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Nigel Farage. Nigel doesn't really need an introduction. He is one of the best known political figures in the UK, loved and loathed in equal measure for his dogged Euroscepticism. He has been an MEP for South East England since 1999, which has allowed him to be a thorn in the side of the European Parliament. He was leader of UKIP between 2006 and 2016, and that of course includes the period of the 2015 general election when UKIP got its largest ever electoral backing, almost 4 million votes. Nigel is also a broadcaster, a businessman, vice chairman of Leave Means Leave, and a member of a new party called the Brexit Party, which aims to uphold the vote for Brexit in the face of a political class that is doing everything within its power to overthrow it. It's fair to say Nigel divides opinion. Some on the left refer to him as an extremist, even as far right, while others argue that he has transformed British politics perhaps more than any other contemporary politician. Simon Heffer says Nigel is one of the most important British politicians of the entire post-war era. Nigel, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. I'm going to correct you, though. I'm going to start off. Let's get confrontational early on. No, the biggest level of support ever for UKIP was, in fact, in 2014. And that was in the European elections when we got over 4.5 million votes, despite a spoiler party being allowed to look like us and get another 300,000. Yes. And that was the election in 2014 that we actually won. UKIP came first in those elections, and I think just sometimes in the Westminster bubble, that fact gets very conveniently written out of history.
That's a good fact to push in there at the very beginning. Well, I want to start off actually with a pretty simple question, which is I can't remember any time in my lifetime when democracy has been under as great assault as it is right now. We had the vote for Brexit, 17.4 million people supported it, the largest vote in the history of this nation. The entire political class, it often feels like, is against it and wants to dilute it or weaken it or destroy it entirely. That goes for the Tories and also for Labour, which has now come out in favour of a second referendum. So the question I want to kick off with, is Brexit going to happen? Is it possible that this huge vote won't happen?
This breach of trust that you talked about it there is actually worse than you said. It wasn't just the fact that 17.4 million people voted, despite being told by everybody and every global leader that plagues of black locusts would descend on our land. They still voted Brexit. And then the next year, 85% of people in a general election voted for parties whose manifestos were absolutely clear. They were going to take us out of the European Union. And then 498 members of Parliament, carried by a majority of 384, voted for Article 50, which said we leave 2 years to the date that we trigger it, with or without a deal. So whichever way you look at this, promises that were made to us that the result will be implemented, but even the votes of MPs themselves are now being effectively disregarded. I have to say this to you. I left the mainstream parties back in the early 90s. I mean, I was a member of the Conservative Party. I joined in 1978. I thought the Thatcher agenda, the medicine didn't taste very nice, but it was absolutely necessary. It modernised the country. It made us a place worthy of investment. I gave up on the whole show under John Major. I couldn't see what the point was of any of it if we were actually going to be governed from somewhere else. So I've been, in a sense, disenchanted with it all for a long time. And yet, I have to be honest with you, even I thought, when Article 50 passed by that majority, I thought, that's it. We've done it. It is going to happen. Right now, we are in a very complicated and difficult position because on the one hand, the way we leave the European Union is to back Mrs May's deal. But on the other hand, we're leaving one treaty for another treaty, which is arguably worse than the one we're leaving. So is it going to happen? Here we are a week before the crucial votes in Parliament. I'll give you my best guesstimate of where we are. I think there's a 20% chance we leave on WTO terms. The reason being, even though Parliament doesn't want it, statute law is there. And if this Prime Minister wants her legacy to be that she delivered rather than she failed and effectively was forced to stand down over the course of a summer, then there is still that chance that we leave on WTO terms. And I'm very, very encouraged by the work that's been going on for the last few weeks. We're seeing the CFTC come to the city and everything's signed up there. And even Mark Carney, the awful Mark Carney, says actually most of the things have been put in place, and now his projection of the amount by which the economy would collapse has halved. So I'd put that 20%. I would put Mrs May's deal going through at about 30%. There will be some Labour MPs who are tempted to say to their constituents they're honouring the vote. I'm talking about the Midlands, the North South Wales, areas like that. Also, the bribe's helpful, isn't it? 1.6 billion quid. So you say to your constituents, look, I've honoured what you voted for, and there's money coming into, whether it's Stoke or whatever, or Wigan or whatever it is. So there will be some Labour MPs who vote for it. The real question is, what do the ERG do? And it seems to me that Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, is getting nothing substantial at all in Brussels in terms of the backstop. The one thing that makes this deal go through is if members of the ERG decide that the unity of the Conservative Party matters more than delivering the Brexit result and what's right in their hearts for the country. But I'd put it at 30%. And 50%, to me, the favourite, and funny enough, I've been saying this since last August, is extension of Article 50, and that is what I think will happen.
I wanted to ask you about the ERG, because I think how you've just described the political class is how a lot of people feel. A lot of people never had much faith in the political class. You would refer to them as liars and charlatans. You hear those comments around the country over the past few years, past couple of decades, in fact. But I think even ordinary people are shocked at how duplicitous the political class has been since Brexit. And I think you mentioned that you were a member. You were in the Conservative Party, kind of lost faith under Major, as I'm sure many people did. That's one of the most shocking things, the fact that even the Tory party, sections of which have always been fairly Eurosceptical, it seems incapable of pushing through this vote, even down to the ERG, who I think have turned out to be a little more cowardly than people thought they might be.
Well, you see, I mean, you said that people view them as liars and charlatans, and that's bad enough. I'll tell you what's worse than that. Careerists. It's even worse, because actually what it means is you've got people who, and let's be frank, most people in politics in this country are not worth much out there on Main Street. I mean, no, come on, let's be honest about it. These are not talented people who've given up careers in something to go into politics. These are people who, ever since they did PPE at Oxford, have wanted to be members of Parliament. I mean, that covers, of course there are exceptions to that, but so many people, and not just in the Conservative Party either, have gone through that kind of route. So to them, and they've got mortgages and young kids or whatever it is, and to them, the absolutely most important thing is getting re-elected next time round. And that, I think, is the biggest problem that we've got. Quite how we change the landscape of British politics and get people in who are doing it for a real sense of purpose, and get people in who've risen to the top, whether it's of their trade union or whether it's they've done well in the army or in business or whatever it is. I'm just not quite sure. But that, I think, is the real problem we face. And I one or two of the ERG, I've listened to them talking. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, matey. You really wouldn't want to do something that might threaten your re-selection prospects. So yes, and I think there is this astonishing disconnect that exists between Westminster and, I always say, the world outside the M25, but actually it's not true. It's only a few central London boroughs. Get out of Welling or whatever, you find Absolutely. It's a very different place. But what interests me is the political class were shocked at Brexit because Brexit exposed the disconnect. And I would say the disconnect now is far greater than it was at the time of the Brexit referendum. I think it's actually out there. What I'm getting from many people is literally revulsion. Mm-hmm. They cannot, and that, by the way, not just coming from hardcore leavers, that's actually coming from a lot of people who voted Remain because, and I've met them, Nigel, I've got a mortgage, a new business, I was worried about instability. But even they can see that unless we're to become a banana republic, unless this place, that gave us the mother of parliaments, unless this place is to be totally devalued, this has to be honoured.
I completely agree that the disconnect is larger now than it was in June 2016, primarily because people have seen the assault on democracy that has taken place. And they now know that all those focus groups we've had for years and all those pleas with us to engage in democracy and all those desperate pleas by politicians, vote, get involved and so on, was completely phony. And as soon as we say something that they find disagreeable, they do everything within their power to prevent it from happening. So one question I had for you, in fact, was to what extent do you think we are potentially witnessing not just the overthrow of Brexit, which is an incredibly important vote, but also the unravelling of the democratic era itself? And I cast my mind back to last year, when everyone in Parliament was cheering the Representation of the People Act and the suffragettes and the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote for the first time, and working class men as well, in fact.
Yeah.
Now they are snubbing the largest vote in history, which includes, of course, the votes of 8 million women. So do you think there's a danger we're entering an era in which the political class turns against democracy itself?
Of course, the post-democratic age. I mean, a magnificent phrase that I heard Peter Mandelson uttering about 20 years ago. And let's be honest, the great battle that is going on here, America, across Europe, and is being debated all over the free world. The great debate is, what is the way forward in terms of how we're governed? Is it the globalist approach, which is big, supranational structures, which in the main are run by people who can't be voted in and therefore can't be voted out? Or is it the nation state, or nationalism, if you want to use that word? That is the big debate that is going on everywhere. And if you really think about it and go right back to the 1950s, the origins of the European Union, which is, I would argue, the epicenter of the globalist dream. It's why the Hillary Clintons and others are completely in love with it. The origins of it, if you read Monnet back in the 1950s, he makes the argument that democracy is a very inconvenient way of running a country, because, the ship of state goes in that direction for 4 years and then it might go in a different direction for 4 years. So better, he thought, with no sense of irony given the Soviets and their 5-year plans that they put in under Stalin, better, he thought, to make sure that the people who really control how our lives are led are the intellectual elites, who, of course, know so much better than we do. And so the whole European project was based on that from day one. Yeah, we have a European Parliament, but I think Jimmy Goldsmith called it a false moustache. Actually, we have been, our leaders have willfully been taking us to a place where democracy is devalued. Now, the question that fascinates me in this country right now, and you're quite right, to identify the level of disconnect, the growing well of anger. The question is, how are we as a country going to deal with this? And where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years' time? Are we going to submit? Are we going to submit and go on being governed by these appalling people? Juncker, he's bad enough before lunch, let alone afterwards. Tusk, these ghastly people. Or are we is Brexit actually going to be the first sort of almost neo-revolutionary step back to where we need to be? Now, I get people telling me, oh, well, Nigel, if this gets stopped and if, Brexit delayed equals Brexit betrayed. Yeah, okay, I get the narrative. I completely understand it. I agree with it, because it shows a total failure of our leaders in every sense. But are we going to become yellow jackets? Are we going to take to the streets and start tearing up cobblestones and chucking them through bank windows? Well, the answer is we're not French. And I don't actually think we will get large-scale civil disorder. I just don't think we're made that way. What worries me are, and I get this on my OEC show, and I get this in letters, there's a growing number of people saying, we're never, ever going to vote again. I met a chap in Cornwall, he said to me, Nigel, I haven't voted for 35 years, but that referendum, that means so much to us and our fishing communities here in Cornwall. I thought, well, the hell with it, I'm going to go and do it. He said, if this isn't delivered, I'm never voting for any, I'll bleep the word out, person ever again. And that's the worry. The worry is, do we just give up? Do we just stop engaging with the process? Or are we going to be able to provide a vehicle outside of the established two parties that offers people hope, offers people a way of getting back at this and getting what they want without either resorting to violence or total abstentionism? And I think my faith in the British people over this issue is very strong, because it seems to me what's happened to us. You give a chocolate bar to a 6-year-old kid, right? You put a chocolate bar in front of a 6-year-old kid and then take it away again. They will scream and shout and hoot and holler because that expectation hasn't been fulfilled. And I think Brexit's like that. I think these voters who are saying if there was a second referendum, they live in Sunderland or wherever they are, if there was a second referendum, I wouldn't bother to vote again. I just think we have to inspire them and make them realise that actually Brexit was the first step of us actually getting back a more accountable form of democratic control. So I have to tell you, despite all of this, and despite my predictions of delay and everything, I'm actually pretty bullish about this. I think there's been a reawakening out there of an idea that actually we can beat them. And all right, if we didn't beat them first time, we'll beat them bigger next time.
I think that's the crunch question in many ways, whether the response to the potential betrayal of Brexit will be apathy or anarchy. And I think I think a lot of people are asking themselves, well, if we can't get what we want through the ballot box, how do we get it? Maybe we can't get it at all.
Let's call it structured anarchy.
Yes, structured anarchy. Let's go for some structured anarchy.
But I mean, that's one of the things, Brendan, that I've been doing. As I said to you, I thought with Article 50 we were there. I realised last July and August, post-Chequers, we weren't there. I was really shocked that the Conservative Party did not bring down the Prime Minister over that. It showed me how gutless and spineless, same as Maastricht, it really was very disappointing. So what I've been doing is trying to set up structures and get involved in things that will give people somewhere they can channel their feelings. And so that's why I joined the Leave Means Leave group last August, which been run by John Longworth and Richard Tice since the referendum, but I joined it. We've gone out around the country and we've showed actually we can get left and right and business figures and people from across the spectrum together on platforms. So I've been involved in that, and if worse did come to the worst, and they forced us to fight again, we would have a very credible vehicle, run by people without personal political ambition. And that was what messed up the Leave side last time, is that the personal ambition of those who wanted to become Prime Minister and those who wanted nice jobs in Number 10 got in the way, I think, of a unified campaign. So I've been doing that. But the other thing I've done is I've been fairly instrumental in the establishment of the Brexit Party. Now that obviously, for me, member of UKIP for 26 years, the better part of my life, almost the whole of my adult life, I've been involved with UKIP, and all UKIP had to do, was just keep the ship steady. And their moment would have been now, in a quite remarkable way, in my opinion. These are the most propitious circumstances for UKIP ever. Sadly, they've gone off in the wrong direction. They've allowed thugs in, etc., and that just puts a glass ceiling on what they can achieve. So I am behind the creation of the Brexit Party. We are now a registered, legitimate political party, and I am saying to members of Parliament, the last time, that sort of period of 2012 to 2016, that I was very much up at the front in British politics, you hated me being there. Well, I tell you what, if you don't deliver a proper Brexit, you'll have me back. I'll be back. And so that's my pledge. My pledge is that if we get a delay, we will be contesting European elections on May the 23rd, and I'll be back and I'll give it everything I've got.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about the Brexit Party in a moment, but first I want to ask you about the Labour Party, because listening to you talk about the globalist agenda and the birth of this kind of European monstrosity, which explicitly weakens democracy in all nations, you remind me of Tony Benn. And one of the things that I often find quite depressing about today is the death of left-wing Euroscepticism. And in fact, it's worth reminding people that when Corbyn first became leader of the Labour Party, everyone freaked out. But actually, you made some favourable comments. And you made the comment in particular that Corbyn has traditionally been very Eurosceptic. He was kind of Tony Benn's bag carrier and researcher.
I said he was nearly a proper chap.
That's right, nearly a proper chap. So I think the cowardice of the Tory party is one thing, but I think there are a huge number of voters out there, particularly in the north of England, in Wales, other parts of the country, who look at Labour, which is now going for a second referendum, and will be shocked.
Well, Islington Labour and Tommy Atkins Labour are a long, long way apart. I remember Tony Benn. Giving me a bit of a rollicking once. We'd been on a panel and I'd said something. And he said to me in the green room afterwards, he said, just because I'm a Republican doesn't mean I'm not a patriot. I am a patriot. And I said, Mr. Benn, I will never, ever assert anything. He really And I felt actually quite embarrassed that I might have said something that inferred that he wasn't patriotic. It was a question about the Queen. And I mean, the other guy that I knew better than Ben and shared quite a lot of platforms with was Peter Shaw. You know, I mean, goodness me, couldn't people in the old days actually speak?
Yes.
They didn't need notes or teleprompters. You know, they knew their subject and they cared. And these were intensely patriotic people, as were their voters. And I think, you know, the Labour Party has been hijacked by two phenomena, really. One, of course, is momentum and the hard left and the nastiness and some of the anti-Semitism and the abuse and all of that, which I've suffered firsthand quite a lot of. But the other hijack of the Labour Party is they all live in Islington. I mean, look at the front bench. Look at them all. You know, Emily Thornberry and Sir Keir Starmer. And it's this sort of David Lammies. Or it's all this North London elite. They see themselves as internationalists. Yeah. But actually, they're anti-democrats. And that gap between them and millions of Labour voters is absolutely huge. So I think the future of the left and centre-left of British politics is a deeply fractious one. Yeah. And who's to say the centre of the future of the centre-right could be the same? You know, we could be heading here for fragmentation, and I think maybe not now, but I think part of this desire by people to have representatives who are a bit more like them, I would say the general election after next, we will have a form of proportional representation because that's what the country now wants.
I think absolutely correct that they present themselves as internationalists, but actually there's something very different. It always reminds me of another old Labour person, Barbara Castle, who did a wonderful speech at Oxford University during the first referendum on EC membership, where she said, this is not internationalism, this is Euro-jingoism. And it was a very powerful reminder. Well ahead of its time. Yeah, no. But I wanted to ask you, on the thing that Labour is proposing, outrageously in my view, which is the second referendum. So you're accused of having flip-flopped on a second referendum, but actually, when I read your comments on this, I absolutely understood where you're coming from. So what you were suggesting, I think, is that the attack on democracy has been so profound, and the undermining of public opinion has been so thorough, that possibly going back to the people and allowing them to say one more time, screw you, we want Brexit, might be a good thing to do. Yeah. But in principle, a second referendum is a bad idea.
It's an appalling idea. But this is about mindset, right? Most of my colleagues who I've, across the parties, who I've fought in the referendum campaign with, whenever they were faced with Brexit could be delayed, there could be a second referendum, said, no, fingers it is, no, everything's going to be absolutely fine. The Prime Minister is committed to delivering Brexit. And I was saying, hang on a second. Let's just mentally get ourselves ready in case this goes wrong. What I was doing there was getting myself mentally prepared. If this happens, we have to... There's no point saying we're all going to stay at home, provided the question's half reasonable. You know, well, we could come on to that. But there's no point doing that. And actually, don't think the other side aren't mobilising. Don't think that Malloch Brown with Soros's money and Alistair Campbell... Don't think they're not getting ready to fight a second referendum. Lord Adonis, you know, I mean, you know, they are. So it was once I'd made that mental conversion that it could go horribly wrong, and therefore we had to start getting structures in place. So, as I say, I'm not flip-flopping on it, but if it comes, we need to be ready.
I think the question is key here, because if the question were to be between May's deal and staying in, that's a real problem, because then effectively what that means is that the option to leave has been taken off the agenda. So the thing that the largest number of voters in history voted for would no longer be an option. And then the argument for a boycott becomes pretty serious.
Yeah, I think if that was the question, I'd just go to the pub for 2 months.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, not much excuse needed really anyway, but no, I mean, that would be an outrage. It can't happen. Yeah. It can't happen.
But if it was a repeat of the first referendum, leave versus remain, you'd argue for engagement.
Here's my thing. Of course. Yeah. But here's my thinking. My thinking is, into extension, you get the argument for a second referendum being revved up again, all right? But actually, the European elections could kill that in its tracks. Because if what you saw in the European elections, you know, was a dramatic shift in British politics, I think maybe we could put it back in its box. But you know what? If we have to do it again, we'll win it again. We'll win it by a bigger margin. But to win it again by a bigger margin and then to hand it back to the very people that betrayed it in the first place strikes me as being a little bit of a problem.
I want to ask you briefly, this is a huge question which can't really be answered briefly, but let's have a go. The question of why people voted for Brexit, because this is one of the most controversial questions of our time in many ways. If you listen to Ramona's, it's because we're all racist and stupid and low information and all this kind of nonsense. If you look at the Lord Ashcroft polls, which were done on the actual day of the referendum, the number one reason was because people think British laws should be made in Britain under the purview of the British people. So that suggests the vote was really for democracy. Obviously, immigration was in the mix too, but in your view, as someone who was central to that campaign in the run-up to June 2016, what's your sense of one of the key drivers to that?
I remember a day in early 2004, we were voting in the European Parliament in Strasbourg on the accession of 8 former communist countries. That then became 10 in subsequent years. It was pretty obvious that in many cases these countries had not yet made the full transition to full Western democracies, and that part of them joining a few weeks later would be total free movement of people. And I said at the time, not only will this be bad for us, it'll be very bad for those countries too. They will lose the best and brightest. And you look at, Lithuania, nearly 25% of its population have left. All the young doctors have left. All the young lawyers have left. This overnight transition to free movement, this expansion of the European empire. And I realised on that day that if I was able to make immigration as a subject synonymous with membership of the European Union, the whole argument would be in a different place. And that, I think, is what has happened. Millions of people in this country saw fundamental change in their communities, massive negative change when it came to getting their kids into the local primary school, getting a GP appointment, whatever it might be. And they started to ask themselves a question, why is this happening? And if there was one thing I did successfully over that period of time, was to make people realise that it was one and the same thing. So look, the answer is people voted Brexit because we want to be an independent country. And independent countries, amongst other things, control their own borders. Of course, without the immigration question, we would never have got this over the line. But it's actually of itself a subset of that bigger question.
I've always thought the immigration issue was tied to the question of democracy, because people are, if you look at surveys, for example, people don't hate immigrants. No. They're not anti-immigration. No, but the question is whether it's something that we decide or something that's foisted on us in terms of the EU.
And of course, this is the next issue that will come back. Because at the moment, a lot of the posh Tories who were in the Leave campaign, oh, isn't it marvellous that no longer is immigration an issue in British politics? Well, that's because the public think it's been dealt with. It hasn't been dealt with. And I think, and I'll predict here and now, that immigration will be back as the number one issue in British politics within the course of the next 3 or 4 years.
One question I wanted to ask you, just a quick one, is if you regret the Breaking Point poster, because one thing that I think is very interesting about your comments on immigration over the past few years, which people often overlook, you've been quite critical of Enoch Powell in terms of the violence of his language and some of the terms that he used, which you argue kind of made it very difficult to talk about immigration for a long period of time.
Almost impossible to talk. Powell was a brilliant man, and I was privileged to meet him on several occasions, and I think a lot of his writing and his speaking on a wide range of issues, from how you defeat inflation through to sovereignty. I think he had a lot to say and a lot to give. That speech was a huge mistake, a huge political mistake, and oddly, an incredibly clever man, but politically a bit naive. And I think, yes, the violence of the language did mean it was tough to talk about these things. Look, the whole point of the Breaking Point poster was, number one, it wasn't an image, it was a photograph. And that's very important to make that point. And what did it say? It said the EU has failed us all. Because what we were increasingly seeing on our news headlines was outrage in Germany and Sweden and elsewhere. The Hungarians saying no. That this decision just to unconditionally open up the doors that Mrs. Merkel made was a massive political mistake. And I think people could see that if hordes are coming into Europe, it's only a couple of years away when they get European passports, 5 years or whatever it may be. David Blunkett said to me afterwards, after the referendum, he said, Mrs. Merkel did you a huge favour.
Right.
And I think he was right. Do I regret the poster? I regret Joe Cox's murder. So this is what happened. That poster I launched on the Thursday morning so with a week to go before the referendum. It was the day after the fishing flotilla on the Thames, where Geldof had behaved like such a fool. I mean, it was the biggest win for us ever. It was fantastic. Yeah. There's multimillionaire Bob Geldof on a gin palace, shouting at working-class fishermen from Southend. I mean, the imagery, it summed up the whole Brexit campaign in many ways. I launched that the next morning. I had full-page colour ads in 5 national newspapers. I had poster trucks going out all over the country. I had big digiboards in Birmingham, in Leeds. And I mean, this was my big spend of the referendum campaign. And, you know, by lunchtime that day, I got the usual criticism from the usual suspects. Do we have to go banging on about this? But actually nothing out of the blue. Joe Cox, deeply regrettably, was murdered. And by the next morning, I was responsible. And that is what happened. And, you know, for those next 2 or 3 days, I really did have to stand my ground because life was made very... George Osborne saying, you know, Nigel wants to take us back to Nazi Germany and all the rest of it. So, no. And do you know something? A year before the referendum, I sat down with my campaign advisor, and he said to me, if the weekend before the referendum we're defending the loss of 3 million jobs, we've lost. If we're talking about nationality and culture, we'll win. And I remember that Tuesday morning, 2 days to go, coming into the office, and the stuff that was being written about me, I mean, I couldn't even read it. We all agreed in the office over a coffee that morning at Upstate, well, at least they're talking about immigration. And all the way through that campaign, whenever we talked about immigration, we were in their half of the pitch, and they didn't really have any answers, other than to say we were beastly people for even discussing it. I think the truth of it is, I think that poster helped us to get over the line.
I thought one of the ugliest things in the referendum campaign was actually the way in which the horrific murder of Joe Cox was pinned on not only yourself, but pretty much anyone who was vociferously pro-Brexit, which I thought was just such a cheap way to try to demonise what was actually an incredibly popular public sentiment.
I was obviously horrified it had happened, but deeply thoughtful as to what the effect on the referendum would be. I don't think, as a result of the Joe Cox murder, that a single person changed their mind. But I do think, as a result of the Joe Cox murder, the momentum that the Leave campaign, and you could feel it, there was a buzz, and it just arrested it for a period, and I suspect without it, we might have won by more. I mean, no one knows, but that's my feeling, that it did kind of stilt the momentum that was definitely going in Leave's direction.
Yeah. I want to ask you about conspiracy theories, because it seems to me that another way in which, in this current moment, that the vote for Brexit is being attacked and undermined and demonised is through this suggestion that there is this vast conspiracy involving you, Vladimir Putin, Mark Zuckerberg, I think. You know, it's coming from The Observer in particular, who seem to employ a lot of conspiracy theorists. So are you part of a global conspiracy to destroy British democracy?
Well, I wish I was, you know. I mean, I wish I'd been behind everything, Trump, you name it. But I'm afraid I'm just not as good as that. Look, the whole thing's bloody ridiculous. I mean, I'll tell you what it is, though. It's very interesting. The establishment in London, Brussels and Washington, D.C., still 2.5 years on, cannot get it into their head that they suffered these twin losses in 2016. And they actually believe that for us to have done this, we must have cheated in some way, we must have lied in some way, or best of the lot, this is the one I like, because Paul McKenna got involved a bit in the campaign. We must have hypnotised the population. They haven't accepted that defeat. You've only got to listen to Blair, Major, any of them. They have not accepted those results. That's why they're fighting so hard against them. And they're trying to come up with whatever they can to discredit us. They're doing it here with endless stories about Russia, hooky money, whatever it may be. And of course, if you cross the pond to DC, it's exactly the same campaign that's being fought against Donald Trump. It is astonishing. And I have to say, what I find despicable are members of Parliament here using parliamentary privilege to accuse people who were involved in the Leave campaign of criminality. directly, potentially damaging the jobs of people working in this country. And I find that absolutely despicable. But it shows you what we've sunk to.
And I think what they don't realise, or maybe they do realise, is that the people they're really attacking are ordinary voters, because the presumption is that we're so dim, we're so stupid, we're so suggestible that, a few memes on Facebook or a few kind of puppeteering moves by Vladimir Putin could make us vote for something we shouldn't have voted for.
But you know something? I mean, just look at Macron yesterday. Macron making highly abusive comments about the Eurosceptic movement, about the Brexit vote. I don't know who's advising these people. I don't know who advises Alistair Campbell and others to give the impression that Brexit voters are thick and pig ignorant. I don't know who's advising them. I'm happy to pay them to keep on doing it, because actually the more you insult people, the stronger they become in their opinion. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you about, two things. Why you left UKIP and what you think you can do with the Brexit Party. So the first thing is on UKIP. You've said that it's become too beholden to far-right thugs, street activism. It's become something different to what it was when you were in charge and how you envisioned it. So obviously the involvement of Tommy Robinson and a few others. So how do you define the problem with UKIP right now, and do you think it's a lost cause?
One of the things I did do, and it was illiberal, anti-democratic, and perhaps wrong on a level of some individuals, but it was the right thing to do. There are people aged 18 joined the National Front for 6 weeks, or the BNP for 6 weeks, and realised they made a mistake. And on those people it was rough. But what I did in 2006 is made sure that nobody who'd ever been a member of any extreme organisation could join UKIP, let alone be a candidate or a branch, could even join UKIP. We forbade former EDO, former BNP, former hard left groups from even joining the party. And I did that because I wanted us to make conversation about tough issues that everybody else would rather brush under the carpet. I knew exactly what mud they would throw back at us. I wanted to make sure it didn't stick. And I think what's happened over the last 18 months or so is those types have been let back in. And I'm afraid there is a sort of criminal edge to this. Far too many of these people have strings of convictions. This just does not work in British politics, or in fact any real Western politics. And UKIP will continue to exist. Of course it will. It's pretty much now taken the place that the BNP had 5 or 10 years ago. But I would suggest that history tells you in this country, whether it's the National Front, the British National Party, Oswald Mosley, or whatever it is, that the glass ceiling on that vote is probably, 500,000 to 700,000. That's about as much as you'll get on that ticket. So I think what UKIP have done is to waste a phenomenal opportunity. And I was very sorry to reach the conclusion that my journey with them had finished. Very sorry indeed. I see it as a terrible waste.
And I think it's a great shame, because one of the fascinating thing about UKIP for so long is that it became a lightning rod for ordinary people, including working class people's dissatisfaction with technocracy and the European Union and the political class more broadly, which is why it got 4 million votes and then won the European elections, as you reminded us. And so to see it become a kind of lightning rod for something a bit darker is, I think, a shame.
It's heartbreaking for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I helped build this thing, and now they're smashing it to pieces.
So the final question I want to ask you is about Leave Means Leave, which I think is, as you say, has had the involvement of people on the right and on the left. It's got you, it's got Kate Hoey, all sorts of people in the mix. And I think it's been actually incredibly inspiring. It's had huge rallies, which often don't get as much media coverage as smaller get-togethers do by other political organisations. And then there's the Brexit Party. So I guess what I want to ask you is, will the Brexit Party be a one-issue organisation? And I don't mean that as a criticism. Is that actually what we need now? A focus on pushing Brexit through, because we recognise that democracy itself hinges on that.
We formed the Brexit Party to fight these European elections. We will fight these European elections on one simple word: trust. You were told the result will be honoured. This is now being betrayed. The very fact that Brexit's been delayed, if that's where we get to, is because of a collective lack of will of our parliamentarians and indeed our leader to carry out the wishes of the people despite all of those promises. And that's what fundamentally the Brexit Party will be about. It'll be about the single most important issue that I think we've ever seen, certainly for 350 years in this country, in terms of how we're governed, who we are, whether effectively we're even a nation at all. But even more important than that, it's not about the issue, it's about the political class. This is going to be people versus the politicians. There is no other way of looking at it.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much.
Thank you.